Our guest is Genevieve Wood. She is a senior contributor to the Daily Signal, which is published by the Heritage Foundation, and she is the leading voice for The Foundry. Now, that sounds like it's manual labor, so my first question to you, Ms. Wood, is have you all been organized by the Steelworkers Union there at The Foundry? And why not?
No, that's not true.
They get you better wages from all those hard hearts at the Heritage Foundation.
Well, we believe in doing hard work and getting paid on that, not forcing union dues around here.
That's just because you're in a union because you're from Texarkana. The Texas
well, that
side.
might have something to do with it too.
Welcome to 710 KURV. The question is, what happened? The face of the revolt, it seems to me, is Louis Gohmert. Now, I'm not sure why that is. Maybe he answers his phone calls from the national press, or he's a colorful speaker. But what happened to the challenge, just the general question, the challenge to the leader? If everyone's unhappy with Mr. Boehner, why did he survive?
Well, I think the main reason is because not everybody was unhappy, but I think, let's put this in perspective first. You had 25 folks from the Republican Party in the House not vote for Speaker Boehner. That is the most of a sitting speaker, that is the most defections from their own party that has happened in over 100 years.
Good Lord.
So that's pretty big. So
that's like 10% almost.
Yeah, well, and people say, oh, that's not that much. Well, it is significant. And the reason is most people vote for their party, whoever's put up from their party, because, look, if they know he's bound to get elected, many of them fear, or is there going to be a backlash on me? Am I not going to get committee assignments I want? Am I not going to be considered for other leadership positions in the future?
Nah, that won't happen. No.
That would never happen, right? See, I think the number actually could have been much higher than 25, but you had a lot of folks making those considerations.
You strike the king, you must kill him, metaphorically speaking. Right.
Well, that's right, and I think folks like Louis Gohmert, who's a great man. I've actually traveled to the Texas border with Congressman Gohmert to take a look at what was going down in your area near McAllen.
Yeah, so you know where McAllen is.
That's right, and but I think I wouldn't say didn't feel like he didn't have anything to lose, but I think he's been around a while. He's safe in his district. He's not concerned about getting this or that chairmanship, and so he was willing to put his neck on the line, so to speak, and really speak out on this issue, as were a few others, but he certainly was one of the leaders.
When you brought up committee positions, there was a story in the local McAllen newspaper that listed the Texans who have come to power in the House of Representatives, which used to be par for the course, and it kind of faded away. I didn't see, I scanned this article, it was an AP article. I did not see Louis Gohmert's name listed on any committees, and he didn't seem to have any vice chairmanship or chairmanship of anything substantial. Is he really that frozen out?
Well, it's hard to say that Louis Gohmert's ever frozen out because whenever I'm up on the Hill, I chair a monthly event called Conversations with Conservatives, which is a whole host of a number of members of the House that are on the conservative side. Louis is always there. He's always one of the main people that not only speaks but is asked questions by the press. So he may not always be on a committee chairmanship, but in terms of making folks on the Hill understand what's important to a lot of Americans, I think he does a very good job at that.
Genevieve Wood is a senior contributor to the Daily Signal, which is published by the Heritage Foundation, and that's who we're talking to.
Ms. Wood, I have a question. Boehner wins his re-election as Speaker with less than a majority of the House, something that hasn't happened or only has happened 4 times since 1917. Now, can you help me understand how exactly that happens if he wins with less than a majority of the vote?
Sure. Well, so he got 216 votes today, and you need roughly 218 to be a majority of the House because you've got 435 folks there. But the reality is you only have to have a majority of the votes cast. So if somebody was absent today, if there were House members absent and a number of Democrats, for example, were absent because they were attending Mario Cuomo's funeral in New York, you had a few members in the House vote present. There was a member, as a matter of fact, from Texas, a Republican, who voted present as opposed to casting a vote. So only of the votes cast do they have to have a majority. And I believe there were 408 votes cast, and 216 obviously puts him over the line.
So if somebody votes present, does it automatically give Boehner the vote?
Well, it basically what it does is it lowers the number of votes needed.
Okay.
So instead of having 409 votes, there are actually only 408 in that particular scenario.
There was some talk that the Democrats some of them would defect enough to push to a second ballot just to make mischief, and I guess probably see what happened. But they didn't do that.
They well, look. I think if you're a Democrat, you probably would rather have John Boehner as Speaker than say a Jim Jordan or a Paul Ryan or name a few others. So I'm not saying that they wouldn't rather have Nancy Pelosi and somebody from their own party, but Boehner has not been the most vocal critic of some of the things that the administration has done. I should say he's been vocal in some cases. He hasn't followed through in a number of those. And I'd love to be pleasantly surprised as a conservative, but so far, just on what's been done and what's been said since the November elections, I can see why some Democrats say of all the Republicans over there, the ones that are potentially going to be Speaker, John Boehner may be our best bet.
I have an article here, and it says Webster. So you had Webster through himself as a candidate, and then you had Gomer and Yoho. And then you also had others that received votes. Do you think maybe if the ones that, I guess, voted for any one of those three, they might have overturned Boehner as Speaker?
If more folks had voted for the three,
yes.
I don't know. I mean, there was no one candidate who was going to really capture a lot of votes. I don't think. I think if you had somebody like, say, a Paul Ryan who had put his name out there, you would have had a lot more probably defactors in this case. But the very fact that people named anybody, I mean, somebody voted for Colin Powell, somebody named Rand Paul, who's actually in the Senate, all of those are votes against Boehner. Even though there wasn't one other candidate who got a number, the fact that there were 24 who voted for somebody else and one person who said present, those are people who didn't vote for Boehner.
Let me, this is again Davis Rankin, Roxanne Garcia. Genevieve Wood is the senior contributor at the Daily Signal, published by the Heritage Foundation. And we're talking about today's vote to unseat John Boehner as the Speaker, which of the House, the Republican Party, and it failed. I'm a literalist. This is not a baiting question, but I don't fully understand. I don't understand what the complaint is or what the grudge is, or that the people who are unhappy with Boehner have. He's not Nancy Pelosi. He's not a huge government left-wing Democrat. What is it he's not doing or doing, if you can think of some particular instances, which has poisoned him with conservatives?
Sure. Well, I think, listen, most of the people who just won seats in the Senate and who won seats in the House in November all ran primarily around two things. There were a number of issues depending on what state and what district you're from, but they all talked about basically two things. One, repealing Obamacare, not just kind of tinkering with it, but repealing it and replacing it with something different. And two, checkmating the president on these executive actions he's taking, primarily things like what he did right after the election of granting amnesty basically to folks without getting any approval from Congress or anybody else. And since that election, two things have happened. The House had the opportunity to defund the president's actions on amnesty when they went through the whole omnibus bill. They didn't do that. They went ahead and funded fully the Department of Homeland Security.
Well, for 3 months, right? So they haven't.
Well, that's right. They said they're going to revisit it, but the House had the majority back in December. They could have done it then, but they didn't.
The Senate didn't have it. So
the Senate, but the Senate didn't have it. That's true, but they still could have done it and forced the president to have to make a decision.
Well, let me challenge you. What decision? It goes to the Senate like everything else in the last 8 years and dies. And so they have worked themselves up over. And by the way, I'm all for that. I'm not opposed to it. I'm for undoing a lot of that stuff. But it seems to me it's an act of just getting all whipped up and not actually achieving anything because it all dies in the Senate.
Well, but they don't have to get whipped up. They just have to vote on it and pass it. And if the Senate chooses not, that was one provision. It wasn't a whole agency. It was saying we're going to fund the Department of Homeland Security. We're just not going to fund these particular areas that allow the president's executive actions to be funded. Instead, they went ahead and funded it for 2 months, and that means for 2 months, the Department of Homeland Security and all the government bureaucrats here, they're already working out hard in Virginia, are putting the president's actions into place. And I can tell you, as somebody who's followed Washington for a long time, and I'm sure you all know, just knowing government, once something in government gets started, it is very hard to pull it all back. So they've got a 2-month jump start that they didn't have to have. That's my argument. And then two, since over the holidays, Obamacare, both Mitch McConnell and John Boehner, they've talked about where we're going to repeal the medical device tax and we're going to make some fixes to the employer mandate. Well, I'm sorry, but that's not what you ran on. You ran on repealing Obamacare, not tinkering around with it. And to date, they're still tinkering.
How do they, Genevieve Wood, how do they repeat? This is where I get frustrated.
Well, they have the votes now. How do they not have the votes now?
It goes up to Obama. He vetoes it. He is not going to.
But that's fine. If you're only going to do what you think President Obama is going to approve of, then why didn't we just elect Democrats?
Well,
that's very true. I actually agree with her on that.
Well, who asked you? Who asked you? Just because your co-host does. No, what I fear is I fear two things. Essentially, I fear one thing. He is not going to accept cyanide and doing away with the only thing he can really point out that he got, and he wouldn't have got it if his minions in Congress hadn't twisted enough arms to get it passed by one vote. The only legislation, I believe, in a century that has not been passed with large bipartisan majorities, because everyone knew you can't just ram it down. Big changes you can't ram down their throat, number one. Number two, I don't know what they're going to replace it with, and I am not cynical enough. I am resigned to the fact that a lot of Americans are hostile to medicine, they're hostile to insurance companies, and they're not, and this is an involved response, I grant you. They're kind of happy to see the insurance companies and doctors get stuck, and I know the insurance companies are not getting stuck. They're actually getting enriched. But this is going to be an act of onanism. They're not going to achieve their goals. They're going to look like they're bitching again, pardon my French. They're moaning again and not achieving anything, and they're not advancing the ball, but they are angering the electorate, some of whom they're not as right-wing as I am.
Well, I hear you on all that, but we just had an election about this very thing. And people can say, well, no, that isn't what the election was about. Well, I think it was. I mean, when you ask people coming out of the polls, and when you look at who won, and you look at specific races, especially Senate races in some of these states like Colorado and Iowa and other places, that was one of the main things that drove people to the polls, was not tinkering with it, but repealing it. Now, I agree with you. If you just repeal it, did nothing else. But believe me, and I work at a think tank where we have got so many recommendations on what they could replacing Obamacare with. So and there's plenty of legislation, frankly, that's been passed in the House in the last Congress that they could use.
That I knew.
It does take work. It does take using the bully pulpit, but they've got it now. They've got it in the House and the Senate.
Now I don't know where I stand politically, but working congressmen are like two words in two different dictionaries, it seems to me. You got an awful lot of show horses, not many work horses. It always struck me, but I could be completely wrong about that. I guess this is your last question.
Last question. Okay, you had the 25-member revolt against Boehner was the biggest rebellion against a sitting speaker by his own party since 1923. Now, even though they weren't successful, I guess you can say, in selecting a new speaker, do you think that they at least accomplished something for the future?
Good question.
Well, I think they did kind of draw a line in the sand, if you will, to show that there's not full support there. And as you just noted, I mean, that's 10% of your party willing to buck you on the very first vote on something that could actually harm them personally. And to know that there were actually a lot more folks who would have done the same thing if they could have had a secret ballot. Because there will be other things where they aren't going to always know where the votes are. So I think that does send a strong message, but it's one that has to be reinforced over and over again. And that's not just up to other members of Congress. That's up to your listeners and others who care about what's happening.
Do you lobby up there, just out of curiosity?
I do not personally lobby, but the Heritage Action for America, which is the lobbying arm of the Heritage Foundation, does lobby Capitol Hill.
All right. Well, we've gone over what we promised you. Thank you very much, Ms. Wood.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Wood.
You did a good job.
Thank you. Appreciate talking to you all.
Yes,
hey,
bye-bye.
Stand firm in Texas.
Amen. Thank you.
All right.
I had an amen before. You had an amen. Genevieve Wood is with the Daily Signal.